In this lecture, we'll be taking a closer look at the history and the social structural nature of the two-tier labor market system. We will conclude our brief lecture by looking at some of the social values which appear to underpin some of the inequalities or employment biases that exist within this labor market strategy. Sociologist Shirley Better, in her description of institutional racism and its impact on the labor market in the developed and Western world, highlights this notion of employment bias as an important hallmark for understanding or identifying institutional racism as it relates to the organization and distribution of jobs in societies like the United States. The history of the United States reflects much of what Shirley Better is identifying. In her discussion, she takes us all the way back to the mid to late 19th century, highlighting in this case the Foreign Miners Tax Law of 1853 as an example of how, in this case, inequality worked its way into the labor market here in the United States very early on. She writes, the California Foreign Miners Law of 1853 allowed for the collection of taxes almost exclusively from Chinese miners between 1853 and 1870. During the first 4 years of its enforcement, Chinese miners paid 50% of the total revenues obtained from working in this gold mine setting. So the idea here is that Chinese laborers, because of their ethnicity and because of how the surrounding society portrayed and understood them, uh, ultimately they were responsible for paying a greater amount of tax. They were taxed differently under this particular law, and their work, in a sense, became part of that lower tier system that Shirley Better and others identifies when she and others look at labor strategies here in the United States. She continues by identifying the Naturalization Act of 1870, in this case, again, focusing on Chinese immigrants coming to the United States who were, in theory, competing for jobs with other members of the society. In this case, acts such as the Naturalization Act ultimately barred individuals of different social, economic, and ethnic backgrounds from, in this case, particular aspects of the job market. So her point here is that racism, as it was being expressed throughout the 19th century, and then, of course, as we progressed into the 20th and 21st century, these racist tendencies ultimately created discrepancies and inequalities within the labor market system, and that these inequalities, in a sense, were reflecting what we were seeing in the larger surrounding society. And as the attitudes that many individuals within the society had regarding bias and discrimination, as those attitudes changed, we see a historical change in terms of how people are being treated in a variety of social and economic contexts, one being employment. So during the New Deal era, we see a number of reform initiatives that are being proposed by the Roosevelt presidency to be able to push back against employment bias and to provide individuals with greater fairness in a variety of aspects of society. Not all of these reforms were equally felt across the various regions of the United States. Um, Dr. Better definitely approaches the divide between the South and the North as it was experienced by African Americans specifically in relation to this employment issue. However, certain key elements of legislation were enacted, and Executive Order 8802 represents a very progressive approach toward pushing back against employment biases in the American labor market system in the early 1940s. This executive order is also known as the Fair Employment Practices Act, which ultimately banned discrimination as it related to national defense contractors during this war era or this World War era. Although this was a very specific kind of act, the impact that it had starting at the federal level was significant and carried all the way through into the early 1960s as it related to hiring practices and, in this case, the awarding of contracts on the federal level. However, as Dr. Better points out, the nature and the pervasiveness of the two-tiered labor market system in the West continued to persist in light of many of the reforms that we saw as we approach the mid 20th century. And it is in the two-tier labor market system that we see the physical manifestation, and I would say the economic manifestation, of this concept of employment bias. What Dr. Better describes as the operationalization of discrimination in the economic landscape of the United States. To understand a two-tier labor market system, we really should frame it in light of what Karl Marx provided in the early to mid 19th century. Many of his writings from the 1840s focus strongly on this idea of social stratification. In fact, the notion of social stratification as it relates to class struggle is very much rather of a Marxist concept. As you already know, Marxist ideas very much focus on the notion of class. It defines, or they define, class in a sense through a strictly economic lens. However, that economic lens is then applied in both social and historical contexts, as these contexts and what we are looking at reflect uh, with regard to economic disparity between groups in a society. Now, Karl Marx, born in 1818, was really a German historian and social theorist. However, his ideas having to do with social stratification in Western society really became center stage to what he is known for, and much of his theory as it's applied in sociological circles. Marx, in a sense, recognized that one's economic status under the forces of Western capitalism, or a free trade system or a free market system, comes to define an individual. Part of your identity, whether it's social or cultural, can be linked to this idea of an economic status. And the status, in a sense, is what gives rise to the various levels, economic levels within a society that Marx points to. And he creates very typical kinds of levels, large, comprehensive levels that he then applies to this notion of social stratification. At the top, and this is what really coincides with the majority of the upper tier of the two-tier market system, we find the bourgeoisie. These individuals, members of this tier or of this really high up social and economic class in a society, are the capitalists. They're those with the means to produce wealth, meaning they have the greatest access to things like land, labor, and capital, and the means by which one can generate wealth in society. In Dr. Better's description of this upper tier, she recognizes in the modern world this to be the place of the CEO, the highly paid professional, or individuals who have corporate jobs, high level, technologically skilled kinds of employment opportunities, and of course, the people who fill those particular levels within the labor market. Now, the kinds of discrimination that we recognize within the structure of society begin to be reflected in this upper tier. She writes that generally in this upper tier, within the two-tier labor market system, we find the highest percentage of white males, some females, and some minorities. But the idea here is that white males are being over expressed in terms of their demographics within this upper tier within the employment network. Now, Marx did not necessarily identify specific segments of the society. He was speaking more broadly about who benefits from a free market system of trade and who benefits ultimately from a capitalist system, a capitalist economic system. Below the bourgeoisie, Marx then recognized a middle class, but a middle class that, in a sense, still retained a certain level of skill and access to production. He referred to this middle tier as the petty bourgeoisie. This would be today considered to be the middle class um, and the lower middle class with regard to expressions of small business. It would incorporate both men and women. It would incorporate demographically both the minority and the majority in terms of the hegemony of the surrounding society, but in a sense, this would be more of a mercantilist class, meaning it would be individuals that would have still pretty good access to the means of production. They would have generally skilled and white collar expressions to their work, and they would have again, an advantage over individuals who fall into the last tier, or the final category, which is the largest in the Marxist system for social stratification, and that would be the proletariat. So, according to Marx, the proletariat then is, or comprised, or comprises rather, the lower classes of the society. These would be the exploited working classes of the society. And generally, this would be well within the lower tier of the two-tier labor market system. So, just to review a little bit, when you're looking at the upper and lower tier system that Dr. Better is providing you with and comparing that to this kind of three strata within the Marxist system, or the social stratification that Marx is providing us with regarding Western society, you have to take that petty bourgeoisie and split it in two. Portions of the petty bourgeoisie would fit into a middle or upper middle class environment, while others, the majority of which, according to Marx, would fit more into that lower middle class and would fall into the lower tier within the market system. They would be more at risk, for example, as would the proletariat, who lives by their nature in a certain level of economic risk. Now, when Dr. Better is describing the lower tier aspect of the two-tier market system, she describes generally the individuals within this lower tier as predominantly being clerical, semi-skilled in nature, or non-skilled in terms of labor jobs or service providing jobs. She identifies janitorial kinds of jobs being part of this lower tier system, farm laborers, things like that. And she also identifies that the quality of these jobs would be considered generally poor. Or unhealthy in the sense. The work is dangerous at times. There are limited benefits for some of the risk that people are taking. Very often, low tier jobs are recognized socially as undesirable. And so she's really distinguishing between the upper and lower tier as it relates to the kinds of jobs that individuals are participating in. And that fits well within the proletariat concept of Karl Marx and his stratified social system. She finalizes her discussion by saying that within this lower tier, then we find a very high percentage in the West, and of course in the United States, which is really at the center or heart of her study. We find a very high percentage of minorities. We have a well expressed percentage of females, and then, of course, poor whites also fit into the lower tier of this two-tier market system. But the thing that we have to keep in mind, and something that is reinforced by the writings of another historian and social theorist, Karl Polanyi, is that the two-tier system, the system of inequality within the Western world that we recognize today, is something that is not new to the human existence or the human story. The idea of a pre-capitalist system of inequality, structural, that is manifesting itself very much in a political and economic manner, is something that Karl Polanyi focused on and argued for in his book The Great Transformation, first published in 1944. In his work, he proposes the idea that the market economy, especially an economy that could be better described as a bourgeoisie economy, is something that is not necessarily just a product of the Industrial Revolution and that particular era of European development, social and technological, but it is something that we find really beginning with the rise of the state as a political concept, no matter where that's occurring on the planet. The idea here is that the kinds of inequalities that result in social stratification and the development of a class system within society is something that is part of a market economy, and generally a market economy that expresses free trade. But it is also something that is not, again, relegated just to modern history. This is something that we even see before the rise of a historical period in anthropological, archaeological, even historical circles. And many of his ideas have been applied to even historical and prehistoric expressions of state level societies such as the Aztec Empire or the rise of the Mayan Empire here in the Americas. The idea that they, as developing state level environments, existed outside of a traditionally European or Near Eastern state level development, and they still manifested many of the extreme class status differences that we recognize in this case to be a part of this bourgeois economy. In the case of the Aztec Empire, for example, which is a phenomenon that predates the 15th century but is recognized by most historians as being codified in the opening decades of the 15th century. The Aztec Empire is a very good example of what Polanyi is talking about in The Great Transformation, because they ultimately were taking three very distinct uh, ethnic groups, three very distinct multi regional, very large language communities, and they brought them together under a single state level political structure. And in this state level political structure, we recognize, looking at their archaeology, looking at their expressive culture, in this case art, and then of course looking at the details of Europeans who came into contact with the Aztec Empire very early on in that 15th century, we realize that they had a highly stratified society, and one that very much conformed to both what we see in the Marxist bourgeoisie economy, but also something that we recognize as, or with regard to Polanyi's pre-capitalist expression of social stratification. So they represent a very good example for this kind of pre-capitalist, socially stratified state level society. So when we step back and take a look at the impact that extreme expressions of social stratification have on interpersonal interactions, and of course larger social structural policies and ideas as they relate to politics and economic reform, we realize that the root of conflict in the society, as Marx would point out, is something that cannot be isolated from economic patterns. So the two-tier system that you are looking at more closely as part of this section of the lecture series is something that very much contributes to some of the social strain, social stress, and ultimately some of the social and political policies that are associated with this notion of more structural systems of inequality and discrimination. So, again, what Marx was recognizing here, or what many of his ideas can be further classified as, is this idea of a bourgeoisie economy, and that inside of the bourgeoisie economy, the notion of class conflict is commonplace. And this is a pervasive concept. You don't have to necessarily be a Marxist to be able to understand how these economic relationships and those economic tiers that Marx recognized in these two tiers that Dr. Better is talking about, how these will translate to class conflict and discrimination. Most sociologists, for example, recognize that class conflict is more than just a bourgeoisie versus proletariat kind of phenomenon. Their tensions um, that they are highlighting are things that are much more connected to not only the means of production, our ability to be part of this wealth building system, but also how we are then able to extract wealth from that productive process. The idea that you or I may not have the same kinds of experiences, we may not have the same kinds of connections to wealth producing kinds of practices within the society. And this creates a pretty strong sense of strain within the society itself. Many authors within sociological circles looking at this find that within every hegemonic environment within a society, especially with or as it relates to modern society, that there are pretty significant differences with relation to how people are able to interact with systems of power, or how they are able to navigate through systems of economic and social power. So, if we take a look at some of the statistics, it reinforces a lot of these trends that we're seeing in terms of the economy and in terms of individual interaction with the labor market. Kozer, in his studies, recognized the fact that in 2007 and 2008, 10% of the United States population controlled over 70% of the nation's economic capital. And we have seen this increase since then. And of that 10%, 1% of the entire population controlled nearly a third of the nation's economic capital. And it's not just, according to the Marxist theory, it is not just control over the capital, but it includes the ability to produce capital or to use an expression of capital to be able to increase individual or group wealth. So then, with this as a kind of backdrop, we have to ask ourselves how sociologists will actively measure this notion of class conflict, the economic underpinnings for class conflict and social strain, and then the relationship between, in this case, economic power and things like social control or social power. Well, there's three particular kinds of measurements that we can take all of the research that's currently being conducted and kind of condense it down into, and I'll list these out. And they're not in any particular order, they're just three approaches that can be taken, and we see this in current research. Initial questions and again, surveys are very good resources for this, but initial questions will take a look at personal perspectives. So people will be asked, or they will be interviewed as part of the process, and they will be asked um, something about class. First of all, the class that they self identify with as a household. And then, based upon that, we will follow up with questions regarding how that category of class impacts their daily lives. And that impact is going to be something that is principally economic in terms of what we're trying to find out more about, right? The kind of data we're trying to draw from this process. So we will take a look at the idea of wealth as it relates to class in this first consideration. Uh, do you have or do you believe that you have fairly good control over your own ability to improve or produce wealth, and how does that relate to your class status? Or one may ask about career. Is your class or is your understanding of your economic class in any way, shape, or form connected to your personal understanding of career? Would you self identify, for example, as a lower blue collar worker? Or would you consider yourself to be a skilled blue collar worker? Or are you a white collar worker? Or are you in clerical sales or kind of a technical field, right? So on and so forth. Would you consider yourself to be part of a managerial or professional class? So these are the kinds of initial questions that sociologists will ask, and then people will, of course, um, identify or self-identify. And that's the other connection that we're going to make here, which is class and identity have been conflated in modern society. A second measure or a second process that we see being utilized in a lot of modern research relating to economic theory in sociological circles is taking a look at the notion of social action, which we've talked about before. So we're measuring then economics as they relate to this notion of social action, what people become involved in, and whether or not there are similarities in that involvement as they relate to economic or social power or status. So looking more at group dynamics, larger patterns. So asking follow-up questions and recording data that relates to how individuals will organize according to their class status and their economic experiences and their economic relationships with the means of production or the means by which individuals in modern society are able to build and maintain levels of wealth. So surface usage is a very good example. Have you ever utilized public shelters? Or in this case, are you renting or owning the home or apartment that you or condominium that you are currently living in? Do you own your car outright, or is that something that is under a lease? And if so, why? Or is that something that was gifted to you? So on and so forth. Other kinds of questions that fit into the second category could include things like medical insurance or homeowners insurance if you do own your home. So, what is the level of risk that you are covered for? So, that would again measure how much risk individuals within specific social and economic groups and classes are taking on. And this ties in directly to what Dr. Better was taking a look at in her primer, which is when we move into that lower tier, there is an increase in the overall risk. And things like health insurance or medical insurance is definitely part of that assessment of risk. A third kind of area inside this second area of data gathering. What about future planning? So the idea of, are you actively building a retirement plan, or do you believe you have economic stability, and how do you connect that to your future? So again, measuring social action. How are you taking action both socially and economically, and do you have the means of being able to take that action without any sort of barrier or barriers being in your way? The third and final area that of measurement that sociologists will take a look at, and this one is something that we are seeing currently played out nationally here in the United States, which has to do with political views and voting habits. That's another area where we start to see patterns as they relate to, well, a kind of economic disenfranchisement. The idea that if you believe that you are unable to move outside of the economic class that you were born into or that you are currently finding yourself within, how does that impact your view of public policy, uh, politics, reform, and things like nationalized systems of healthcare, or nationalized systems of being able to deal with health related issues. So, how does that impact your voting habits? How does that impact your political perspectives? And so, again, we're finding that all of these things are interconnected in some way, shape, or form. How you self identify, um, or your personal identity, your group affiliation, and how you act in relation to that, and how others act within that setting. And again, group can be defined solely by class, if that's how you're looking at it, and then your political views and values, and how that ultimately works its way into your voting practices. So these again are things that ultimately have been very, very helpful in being able to, in a sense, understand an individual's situation as it relates to this two-tiered labor market and some of the inequalities that are endemic to a free market system. Not that a free market system is bad, it's just um, given the particular kinds of inequalities and structural discriminatory practices within a society, are those working their way into the labor market? And if so, how would we potentially prevent that from cross-pollinating in a sense? Now, in your notes, I would like to build in one piece of information that isn't visible on this slide. And so you can pause the lecture as we move through it to be able to kind of get all this material into your notes, because I think it is very, very important. And it relates to this notion of how sociologists actively measure and understand uh, inequalities within the labor market setting. A sociologist, John Goldthorpe, Goldthorpe, John Goldthorpe, uh, did some groundbreaking research in the 1970s and 1980s, taking a look at this interrelationship. And he organized people into employment categories. He called them employment categories, but ultimately they were class statuses, similar to what we see with a Marxist system or this two-tier system that we're looking at in this lecture as well. And what his interest was is that he wanted to measure their individual interests as they related to these economic class statuses, or these different employment categories. So how does one's political points of view, um, or how does one's social relationships or economic relationships, how are those in a sense connected to a career and social action? So he divided his kind of class scheme into three major categories based upon employment, and then he began to measure some of these particular sociological characteristics in light of those three categories. And so let me give you the three categories and then just real quickly give you an idea of his results. And these again are in no particular order. However, I think you could probably create a hierarchy based upon earning potential and some of these other uh, qualities. So the first that he recognized was a service class, a service class. These are professionals, highly qualified technicians, administrators, managers, supervisors, and government officials. So he created that category, again, labeled it more as a class, and then got into that and said, okay, what are some of these political or social practices or viewpoints that we can relate to that? So a service class. A second class or category he identified was an intermediate class. These would be individuals who would be small scale artisans or contract service providers, non manual labor employees, low grade technicians, foremen, right? And this would be an area where we would start to see middle class and lower middle class kinds of occupations being relegated, or where we would find them densely expressed in this intermediate class. And then he recognized a working class, very similar to the kind of proletariat that we saw in the Marxist system. So a working class or category would include laborers, contract laborers, wage workers, temporary employees, and agricultural laborers. But again, you can add many to this. And then what he did was he started to ask some of the questions that I already highlighted. So we have a service class, an intermediate class, and then that working class. And then he's asking questions about things like party preference, so political party. So with regard to party preference, what he found when he looked at the service class, for example, is that the majority were actually independents. They were individuals that really didn't affiliate with one party or the other. And then in terms of Democrat and Republican, they broke down about 30% were, in this case, uh, Democrat, and a little over 25% were Republican. When we juxtapose that to the working class, we see a different kind of expression. Again, the independents were the majority, but not by as much as we saw with the service class and definitely with the intermediate class as well. And then the majority there in terms of party affiliation or party preference in this case would be Democrat. In this case, 34, maybe 35% were Democrat, and about 19% were Republican. And of course, he didn't just look at Democrat and Republican, he also took into consideration Libertarian and other right or left leaning political parties. And so he started to see some patterns there as well, that individuals who were in a working class or in an intermediate class were skewing toward political parties that expressed a much stronger message regarding social and economic reform, whereas our service class was kind of split between the two. Um, and so, again, that's what he was seeing in terms of some of the results. With regard to political choice, the same thing happened. And what he was seeing in the case of party affiliation and some of the important concepts, the important issues that the different categories of career based groups had, it did fluctuate in a pretty statistically significant manner. And I won't go through all of the data, but I'll give you some takeaways from that as well. So, the idea here, in terms of some of the variables he was looking at attitudes toward government, private property. He was taking a look at the idea of intervention with regard to the role that public reform should play in the daily lives of people. He took a look at some of the demographics as well, the average ages, um, female versus male, white versus non-white, and he noticed that again, when you're dealing with, let's say, service classes, there are different demographics that are being expressed there. Some of these we've already touched upon, and of course, Dr. Better has highlighted some of those as well. But then, in terms of some of these issues, the notion of property, for example, and private property rights were things that were very much valued in all three classes. But the idea of access to, the means of producing wealth, the means of being able to um, own and operate different aspects of capital, like property, were things that did statistically vary. And again, very strong takeaways. The idea of a Democrat versus a Republican perspective, or a service category versus an intermediate versus a working class category. Um, Again, people are very much interested in uh, politics being a source of advocacy for their specific interests, and wanting, in a sense, equal opportunity and equal access to some of these very important economic resources that help them to provide for themselves and, of course, um, maintain economic stability for their economic households, or the economic household that they are a part of. So the Goldthorpe system was very, very helpful in understanding how political perspectives and economic perspectives interacted within this unique labor market that we find in the West, and especially hyper expressed in places like the United States. The last thing I want to share with you relates to this interaction between economic and social perspectives, and then this notion of identity. And so I wanted to just highlight a few ideas from some research that occurred in the early 2000s, 2006, by Tanya Levy and Catherine Silver. They were taking a look at issues having to do with personal identification of gender and social identity, also gender as a biological construct and identity. And then they were focusing on something that we talk about quite a bit here in the United States, but they were looking at Japan and then extrapolating from there, which is this topic having to do with the gender gap. What are some of the social and structural qualities that reinforce and allow things like the gender gap in terms of our economy, how these things allow that gap to persist. So let's take a look at some of their initial ideas. These ideas relate to uh, national values and identity, because that's really what they're framing a lot of their research in. How the gender gap expresses itself and maybe the source of the gender gap as it relates to Japanese society and as it relates to societies and the society that we identify with the United States. So, as they write in their article, when comparing two nations on broad sets of social values, the concept of social identity is meaningful as a holistic descriptive tool. They continue, by social identity, we mean the values that individuals have internalized within specific areas of their lives. This includes things like family, community, workplace, culture, and politics. Um, so, what they are doing is they're taking a look at Japan, they're taking a look at the United States, they're looking at the similarities that these two societies have with regard to their economies, and now, of course, intertwined these two economies are. And then they are taking a look at the distinct histories and cultural traditions that are associated with family values and gender. And they're taking a look at that in light of the pay um, discrepancies that exist between men and women in both societies, and also how men and women are interacting with and connecting with the different tiers of the labor markets in these two societies. So, in terms of their research questions, there's four that I just want to highlight for you. And again, I'm going to do this in a very superficial way so that it doesn't eat up too much of your note taking, but it is important to take a look at their perspectives and what some of their conclusions and general assumptions were. So here are four kind of research questions that they were looking at in light of this notion of the gender gap. Number one, does gender introduce systematic differences in social values? So how you or I frame gender as we are growing, as we are being socialized. Does this introduce systematic or structural differences as they relate to social values? So, how men and women, for example, perceive um, moral issues or social or economic responsibilities. That was an initial research question. Another research question, the second one, if a value disparity exists, does it relate or is it increased by perceived gender inequalities? So, if a disparity in a social value, or a gender value, we could call it, between men and women, if that exists, does it relate or can it be connected with an increase in perceived gender inequalities? Meaning, if we see a variation between men and women in terms of their interaction with education or their educational level before they enter the job market, or as I said before, income. Is there any sort of wage disparity between men and women, and how does that disparity in social values and some of the meanings that are assigned to those social values, how does that then connect with this income discrepancy? Or occupational choice. So as men and women are choosing specific career types, can we connect those choices in any way, shape, or form to any sort of disparity in social values? Um, any, all along the way, not just their childhood, but all along the way with regard to their life history and life cycle. So that was a second kind of research question and research area. Third, what impact does a social arena play? So the workplace, for example. So, what impact does a social arena play? So, when you or I are out in a social setting, how does our gender play into the behaviors that we manifest in that social arena? And then ultimately, if there are disparities in the social values that we tie to our different genders, how does that manifest itself in that social arena as well? And then, fourth and finally, what impact does gender relationships play within private and public spheres, especially spheres having to do with social practices? So, what impact does gender relationships within, what impact do gender relationships play within private and public spheres, social spheres? So, in the home, um, children interacting with parents, children playing with other children, or in terms of, in this case, practices within a school environment, um, choosing courses, choosing majors, choosing areas of study, expressions of males and females in different areas of study, so on and so forth. And then, of course, in that job market environment as well, training, skilled or otherwise. Um, the number of individuals by gender in different uh, employment settings, so on and so forth. So these are the kinds of questions that they were asking in light of culture and in light of this idea of a social identity and how and when that forms or develops in the life of an individual. What were some of their takeaways, in a sense, or what were some of the findings that they were able to share? Let me just highlight a few of these for you as well. So, when you're talking about the United States as it relates to Japan, it's not apples to apples. The United States has a relatively short history as a nation compared to that of Japan. And so that was something that they definitely had to take a closer look at. And that was something that they did see reflect itself in both politics and, of course, in many cultural traditions as well. Another thing that they noticed right away is that, um, you know, how things like urbanization were being experienced in both of these national settings was a little bit different. The idea of housing crises, uh, very tight labor market environments and the conditions associated with that varied across these two national environments. The notion of change and how rapidly change could occur, again, also did fluctuate. And they found that, again, Japan was changing, but it was changing at a much slower rate than the United States. So the United States was very much identifying and being able to adapt to some of these biases, employment biases that they were seeing in the initial data that was being recovered. Additional takeaways, they identified Americans as sharing an allegiance to a set of principles that were outlined in our founding documents. The idea of the American dream was something that was very strongly expressed in the economic values and the social identities that men and women were um, connecting with, and then how they were, of course, manifesting that in their own lives was also something that they did see uh, differently in both the Japanese and the United States models. And then the cultural ethos, or the general cultural landscape of both of these environments was a little bit differently. Things like social mobility, individuality, civil liberties, these were all things that were very much akin to the nation state of the United States, as opposed to what we were seeing in Japan at that time. And so these were things that were very much being reinforced. And then the gender divide. The gender divide was much more strongly expressed in Japan as it related to the labor environment than what we saw in the United States. But this kind of employment bias was something that was seen in both of these westernized kinds of social and cultural contexts. So, in terms of then some of the takeaways or some of their research conclusions, they did again note that the gender gap, in a sense, was very strongly expressed in Japan. Men had stronger expressions when it came to goal setting and following traditional divisions of labor in the home. Um, Men and women were, in a sense, conforming to very strict roles, social roles in the home and outside of the home, and that this was being then made manifest in the labor market as well. Women in Japan were identified as having stronger expressions of social interconnectedness. However, the kinds of results that came from these strong social ties and these much larger social networks were not as economically oriented as we were seeing with the male counterparts in the Japanese example as well. Then, in terms of this notion of expectation and how that was making itself part of this gender gap in economic spheres, the earning potential that we were recognizing or that were being identified for men and women in Japan was hyper expressed in terms of the wage disparity and the kinds of jobs that men and women were actively pursuing in their professional lives. So all of these things were being reinforced, and they were all being, in a sense, connected back to the social identities that were being socialized as part of how men and women in Japanese societies, or in Japanese society rather, were gathering their understanding and developing their understanding of who they were, their social identity, their political identity, and how they fit into the labor market as well. So again, the takeaway that we can have from this study of gender and value and how those two things interact in economic settings is ultimately that the kinds of disparities that we are seeing in economic potential, in choice of job, and in the expression of um, workplace attitudes are things that are not restricted to that workplace environment, but they are things that are structurally and systemically part of the society itself, and they're part of the social value systems that are feeding into how individuals within that society are growing and developing their own sense of who they are and their identity. And that many of the disparities that we are seeing, not just in terms of the labor market itself, but disparities that we are seeing in terms of expectations in the home or in other social arenas, are things that are very much established early on in life, and that there are a number of strong structural factors that continue to reinforce those kinds of disparities um, that and that the economy is in a sense just one area where those disparities are being played out. The last piece is that when you compare Japan to the United States, and it's especially the case in some of the research that was coming out in the 1990s, but then of course in the early 2000s, is that Japan is very much of a hyper expression of the kind of gender gap that we see in the labor market here in the United States. And that, again, is being explained in the sense that men and women in Japan, as they are gathering the social values that underpin their social identities, are being given very strong expressions of identity as it relates to gender, and that those strong expressions are things that are very much persisting throughout their life, and work their way into many of the decisions that men and women are making, um, as it relates to not just economics but also political perspectives and social values as it relates to child rearing and the roles, for example, of men and women in those different kinds of social institutional environments, which include, of course, the family or the household as part of that process. So, when you take a look at Shirley Better's discussion of the inequalities that exist within the two tier labor market system, you can't look at it just through an economic lens, but you have to consider not only the history of the culture, but also the practices within the society as you're assessing why individuals will congregate into one tier or another, and how those congregations of individuals within the market system are also then impacting their own quality of life and many of the values and attitudes that they have regarding their choice of political party and the particular interests that they have regarding important topics in the society. The access that one should have to things like property and the ability to own and maintain property, or wealth in society. The idea that what are the kinds of connections that I should have to wealth production, and what are the expectations that I should have for producing wealth, and what wealth should look like, not just now in my life, but also in the years to come, things like retirement, for example. And then education is another important one. What are the expectations that I should have for myself as I am navigating through and across that educational landscape? What are the goals that I have set for myself, and how do those very much tie into my social identity and some of the expectations that I have for myself in a social sphere as well. So it's a again a complex web, which is Dr. Better's primary thesis. It's a complex web of interrelated kinds of processes that result in the kinds of inequalities and disparities that are identified in our society today. And our economy is one area where we see this kind of disparity made manifest and persisting. And the big question is why?